The flight attendant stood firm, blocking his path. "Sir, you need to move to economy. First class is reserved for premium passengers only." The man looked up, his expression calm and unreadable. She had no idea who she was speaking to. By the time she realized her mistake, it would be far too late. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The plane doors remained open as passengers slowly made their way to their seats. Among them, Daniel Cole settled into his first-class seat, placing his bag neatly under the chair in front of him. He adjusted his seatbelt, feeling the smooth leather against his back. This was a rare treat, something he had never allowed himself before. His life had always been about giving to his students, his school, and his community, but this time he had finally permitted himself a break, one that was long overdue. As he gazed out the window, watching the busy runway, he had no idea his moment of peace was about to be shattered. A shadow fell over him. Sir, I need to check your ticket." Daniel turned to see Ava Monroe, a flight attendant, standing beside him. She was tall, poised, and exuded authority. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, but there was something else in her expression: doubt. Daniel nodded and reached into his pocket, handing her the slip of paper without hesitation. She barely glanced at it before raising an eyebrow. "This is for first class," she said, her voice edged with skepticism. "Yes," Daniel replied calmly. Ava studied him for a moment before pressing her lips together. "Are you sure this wasn't issued to you by mistake?" A few passengers turned their heads slightly, sensing the shift in tone. Some looked away, pretending not to listen, while others watched with quiet curiosity. Daniel exhaled slowly. "No mistake. I purchased it myself." Ava let out a small, impatient sigh. "Right, I just need to confirm something in our system. Please step aside while I handle this." Daniel held her gaze for a moment before nodding. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his presence quiet but firm. The other first-class passengers avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice. Ava gestured for him to follow her toward the galley. She picked up the in-flight phone, punched in a code, and spoke in a hushed voice, but Daniel could still hear the irritation in her tone. After a moment, she turned back to him with an exaggerated smile, the kind that wasn't real. "There seems to be an issue with your booking," she said. "We can offer you a seat in economy while we sort this out." Daniel's jaw tensed, but his voice remained steady. "There is no issue. My ticket is valid." Her smile thinned. "Sir, I don't want to repeat myself. Please take your things and move to economy." The energy in the cabin shifted. Passengers in economy had started noticing. Heads lifted to see what was happening. A quiet murmur spread through the plane like a slow-moving wave. Daniel looked at Ava for a long moment. He saw it in her face. She had already decided he didn't belong here. It didn't matter what he said or what his ticket showed. Her mind was made up. Without another word, he turned, walked back to his seat, and reached for his carry-on. He pulled it from the overhead bin, slid the strap over his shoulder, and began walking down the aisle toward economy. He could feel the stares following him, some filled with curiosity, others with quiet judgment. But no one spoke up. No one said a word. Daniel lowered himself into an empty seat in economy and let out a slow breath. The space was tighter, the seat rougher, but it wasn't the downgrade that bothered him. It was the humiliation. His fingers hovered over his phone before he finally typed out a message. "Boarded. Got moved to economy. Flight attendant refused to check my ticket properly." He hit send. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated. "What do you mean they moved you?" Daniel's gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. Ava Monroe continued her duties, unaware of the mistake she had just made. Another message appeared. "Give me the flight number." Daniel typed it in. There was a long pause. Then, the final message came. "Sit tight. This isn't over." Daniel sat in the cramped economy seat, his fingers resting on the phone screen as he stared out the small window. The hum of the engine filled the cabin, but his mind was elsewhere. The steady hum of the engine filled the cabin, but Daniel Cole's mind was elsewhere. He had spent his entire life teaching respect, fairness, and patience. Yet, in a matter of minutes, he had been dismissed without question, without hesitation, as if he were invisible. The first-class passengers, Those who had watched him be escorted away had gone back to their conversations, their drinks, their comfort. Not a single one had spoken up. Not a single one had asked if he needed help. His phone buzzed in his hand. A new message. Who was the attendant? Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple before typing back. Didn't catch her first name. Last name on her tag was Monroe. The reply came almost instantly. Noted. Daniel exhaled. He had no idea what was happening on the other end of that conversation, but he trusted it. At the front of the plane, Ava Monroe poured herself a cup of coffee, ignoring the sideways glances from the other flight attendants. One of them, a younger woman named Rachel Carter, hesitated before finally speaking. Was there an issue with that man's ticket? Ava rolled her eyes. He was sitting in first class. Rachel frowned. Yeah, but you saw him. Ava cut her off, taking a slow sip of coffee, her voice laced with certainty. He didn't look like a first-class passenger. Probably a mistake in the system. Or maybe someone handed him a ticket he didn't pay for. Either way, I wasn't about to let him stay in a seat that wasn't his. Rachel's stomach twisted. She wanted to say something, to push back, but she knew better. Ava Monroe had been with the airline for years. She had a reputation for being strict. The kind of person who never admitted she was wrong. Rachel glanced toward first class, where the empty seat Daniel had been forced to leave still stood out. Something about this didn't feel right. Back in economy, Daniel's phone buzzed again. What gate are you landing at? Daniel raised an eyebrow, then pulled out his boarding pass from the seat pocket in front of him. He typed in the gate number and sent it back. A pause. Then the last message came. Understood. Just stay put. Daniel leaned back in his seat, watching as the flight attendants moved through the cabin, serving drinks and adjusting trays, acting as if nothing had happened. But something told him this wasn't over, not even close. Up in first class, Ava Monroe moved through the aisle, offering drinks and adjusting passengers' trays, completely unbothered by what had just happened. She had seen plenty of passengers try to slip into first class over the years. As far as she was concerned, this was no different. The man hadn't argued. He hadn't caused a scene. That only confirmed what she already believed. He didn't belong there. What she didn't realize was that her decision had just set off a chain reaction she wasn't prepared for. In the cockpit, Captain James Adler received an urgent message on the in-flight communication line. The moment he read the name attached to the inquiry, his eyes narrowed. He turned to his co-pilot, his voice low and serious. Pull up the passenger manifest. The co-pilot frowned but complied, tapping a few buttons on the screen. The names scrolled by until they landed on one in particular. Daniel Cole. Captain Adler read the details twice, his pulse kicking up slightly. He knew that name. Everyone in the airline did. Back in economy, Daniel's fingers hovered over his phone before he finally typed out another message. Boarded. Got moved to economy. Flight attendant refused to check my ticket properly. He hit send. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated again. What do you mean they moved you? Daniel's gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. Ava Monroe continued her duties, unaware of the mistake she had just made. Give me the flight number. Daniel typed it in. There was a long pause. Then, the final message came. Sit tight. This isn't over. Daniel sat in the cramped economy seat, his fingers resting on his phone screen as he stared out the small window. The hum of the engine filled the cabin, but his mind was elsewhere. Not a single person had spoken up. Not one had asked if he needed help. Daniel Cole sat in the cramped economy seat, his fingers hovering over his phone. Another vibration. Who was the attendant? He sighed, rubbing his temple before typing back. Didn't catch her first name. Last name on her tag was Monroe. The reply came almost instantly. Noted. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had no idea what was happening on the other end of that conversation, but he trusted it. At the front of the plane, Ava Monroe poured herself a cup of coffee, ignoring the glances from the other flight attendants. One of them, a younger woman named Rachel Carter, hesitated before speaking. Was there an issue with that man's ticket? Ava rolled her eyes. He was sitting in first class. Rachel frowned. Yeah, but you saw him. Ava took a slow sip of coffee, her voice dripping with certainty. He didn't look like a first-class passenger. Probably a mistake in the system. Or maybe someone gave him the ticket. Either way, I wasn't about to let him stay up there when he clearly didn't belong. Rachel's stomach twisted. She wanted to say something, to push back, but she knew better. Ava Monroe had been with the airline for years. She had a reputation for being strict, the kind of person who never admitted she was wrong. Rachel turned her gaze toward first class, where the empty seat Daniel had been sitting in stood out. Something about this didn't feel right. Back in economy, Daniel's phone buzzed again. "What gate are you landing at?" He raised an eyebrow, then pulled out his boarding pass from the seat pocket in front of him. He typed in the gate number and sent it back. A pause. Then the final message came. "Understood? Just stay put." Daniel leaned back in his seat and hung, watching as the flight attendants moved through the cabin, serving drinks and adjusting trays, acting as if nothing had happened. But something told him this wasn't over. Not even close. Up in the cockpit, Captain James Adler received an urgent message on the in-flight communication line. The moment he read the name attached to the inquiry, his eyes narrowed. He turned to his co-pilot, his voice low and serious. "Pull up the passenger manifest." The co-pilot frowned but complied, tapping a few buttons on the screen. The names scrolled quickly until they stopped on one in particular. Daniel Cole. Captain Adler read the details twice, his pulse kicking up slightly. He knew that name. Everyone in the airline did. His eyes flickered back to the message on his screen. The request was clear. Confirm immediately if Daniel Cole was removed from first class. The co-pilot glanced over, sensing the tension in the air. "Is that the Daniel Cole?" Captain Adler didn't answer right away. His mind was already racing through the consequences of what had just happened. After a long moment, he reached for the in-flight phone and dialed the lead flight attendant's line. A few seconds later, Ava Monroe's voice came through, light, unconcerned. "This is Monroe." Captain Adler's tone was steady, but there was a new weight behind his words. "Miss Monroe, I need to confirm something. Did you remove a first-class passenger named Daniel Cole?" There was a brief pause on the other end. Then her confident voice returned. "Yes, Captain. His ticket didn't match first-class status, so I had him moved to economy." Captain Adler's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Did you verify his ticket?" Ava let out a small laugh, the kind someone gives when they think they're being questioned over nothing. "Captain, I've been working flights for over a decade. I can tell when someone doesn't belong in first class." A longer pause this time. Then Captain Adler spoke again, but his voice had shifted, colder now. More precise. "Miss Monroe, do you know who Daniel Cole is?" Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Ava didn't respond. Captain Adler didn't wait for her to answer. "Daniel Cole is the owner of this airline." The phone line went dead silent. For the first time since the flight began, Ava Monroe felt something she had never felt before. Panic. Her hands gripped the in-flight phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. And for the first time in her career, she realized she wasn't in control anymore. "No mistake," Captain James Adler replied, his tone firm and unwavering. "Mr. Cole was a confirmed first-class passenger. You removed him without verifying his ticket." Ava Monroe felt the blood drain from her face. "And now," Captain Adler continued, his words slicing through her rising panic, "we have direct orders from the executive office." "Orders?" Ava swallowed hard. What kind of orders?" "You are to personally escort Mr. Cole back to first class and issue a public apology," Captain Adler stated coldly. "Upon landing, you will be required to report to the executive board for a formal review of this incident." Ava's breath caught in her throat. A formal review. This wasn't just a minor complaint. This was far bigger. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. "Captain, I was just following protocol." A brief pause. Then, Captain Adler cut her off with chilling finality. "No, Miss Monroe, you weren't." The line went dead. Ava's legs felt heavy as she made her way down the narrow aisle toward economy. Every step she took made the realization sink in deeper. She had humiliated the owner of the airline, in front of an entire cabin of passengers. She had dismissed him, spoken down to him, and removed him from a seat he had rightfully paid for. And now, she had to face him. The economy section was quieter than before. Some passengers had already pieced together that something was going on. Their eyes flickered between Ava and Daniel Cole, who sat calmly in his seat. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't caused a scene. He hadn't protested. And somehow, that made it worse. Ava stopped beside his row and cleared her throat, forcing a tight, professional smile. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice lower now, no longer carrying the same authority it had before. "There has been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to first class." Daniel slowly looked up at her, his calm gaze locking onto hers. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone neutral. Ava's hands clasped together tightly. For the first time in years, she struggled to find her words. "Yes," she said quickly. "I regret the error. Please allow me to assist you back to your original seat." Nearby passengers stopped pretending not to listen. They had seen everything before, but now they were seeing something new. A flight attendant who had been so certain of herself, suddenly backtracking. Daniel didn't move. He simply tilted his head slightly and asked, "Why?" Ava blinked. "Excuse me?" Daniel sat forward slightly, his tone still calm but firm. "Why are you moving me back now? You seemed sure I didn't belong there earlier." A few passengers exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power. Ava's throat felt dry. There was an error in seating. Daniel studied her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Ava shifted uncomfortably. Her confidence cracked under the weight of his gaze. Then, without raising his voice, without any visible anger, Daniel Cole made her feel something she wasn't used to feeling. Accountability. "I had my ticket," he said. "You saw it." Ava nodded stiffly. "And yet, you still asked me to move," Daniel continued. "You didn't check the system. You didn't ask anyone else in first class to show their ticket. Just me." The air around them felt heavier now. Ava opened her mouth to speak, but for the first time, she had no defense. Daniel leaned back, watching her, his expression unreadable. "If you're going to apologize," he said, his voice steady, "at least tell the truth." A stifling silence fell over the cabin. Ava felt every single pair of eyes on her. She had spent years enforcing rules, making judgment calls, handling difficult passengers without a second thought. But this time, she had been wrong, and everyone around her knew it. Ava Monroe had never been questioned like this before. Not in front of a plane full of people. Daniel Cole didn't gloat, he didn't smirk. He didn't even raise his voice, and somehow, that made it worse. He simply sat there, waiting, patient and calm, like a teacher watching a student struggle to find the right answer. Ava took a slow breath, feeling the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She knew the only way out of this moment was to do something she had never had to do before. Admit she was wrong. She straightened her uniform, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You're right," she said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its usual authority. "I didn't check the system. I made an assumption, and I treated you unfairly." A few passengers exchanged glances. Some were surprised she had actually admitted it. Others, unimpressed that it had taken her this long. Daniel nodded once, as if he had already known the truth, but wanted to hear her say it out loud. Ava shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as the reality of the situation sank in. She wasn't just apologizing to him, she was apologizing in front of everyone. She cleared her throat, her voice more professional now. "I sincerely apologize, Mr. Cole. I should have verified your ticket instead of assuming there was a mistake." Daniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he stood. The moment he did, the tension in the cabin shifted. Ava exhaled, relieved that he wasn't going to push it further. She quickly stepped aside, gesturing for him to follow her back to first class. But before walking past her, Daniel turned slightly. Not to her, to the passengers still watching the scene unfold. "Funny how I was told to move so quickly," he said, his voice steady, almost casual. But when it was time to fix the mistake, that took a little longer. A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread through the economy section. Some passengers nodded subtly in agreement. Others just looked away, uncomfortable with the truth now sitting right in front of them. Ava didn't respond. She just turned, leading him back to first class. She could feel the stares from every row she passed. Her uniform had never felt so tight. Her usual confidence had never felt so fragile. And for the first time in her entire career, Ava Monroe realized this wasn't just about one passenger. This was about what happens when power is misused. She walked stiffly ahead, each step heavier than the last. No one whispered anymore. They didn't need to. The silence carried more judgment than words ever could. Behind her, Daniel followed at a steady pace, unrushed, unbothered, as if he had all the time in the world. As he re-entered first class, passengers turned, their expressions a mixture of confusion and discomfort. Some quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in their books or in-flight screens. Others, the ones who had witnessed the scene earlier, shifted in their seats, because they knew exactly what was happening. Daniel reached his original seat, adjusted his bag, and calmly sat down. Not once did he acknowledge Ava standing beside him. Ava swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain her professionalism. Despite the growing tightness in her chest, the moment stretched too long. She knew she had to say something. "If there's anything you need, Mr. Cole," she said, "please let me know." Slowly, Daniel turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, before finally responding. "You didn't ask me that before." The sentence hit her like a slow, deliberate punch to the gut. Ava blinked. She knew exactly what he meant. She had treated every other first-class passenger with a bright, polished smile. She had greeted them warmly, offered them drinks before takeoff, made sure they were comfortable, but not him. She had walked right up to his seat, questioned him, removed him without hesitation. She had spoken to him with doubt instead of courtesy, with suspicion instead of respect. And now, the power shift was complete. For the first time in her career, Ava Monroe was the one being watched, judged, held accountable. Her voice was quieter now, lacking the confidence it had before. "I apologize for that as well," she said. Daniel Cole didn't respond. He simply gave a slow nod, then reached for the in-flight magazine tucked into the seat pocket and began flipping through the pages, as if she wasn't worth another second of his attention. That dismissal, not cruel, not aggressive, just indifferent, was somehow worse than anger. Ava Monroe turned, her steps stiff as she walked back toward the galley. Then the whispers started. Passengers murmured among themselves, recounting what had just happened. At the galley entrance, Rachel Carter stood watching, her expression unreadable. There was no sympathy in her eyes, no words of reassurance, just quiet observation. Ava had spent years enforcing rules, making judgment calls, holding others accountable, but today, she had learned what it felt like to be on the other side. And she knew this moment would follow her long after the plane landed. It wasn't anger that hit the hardest, it wasn't frustration, it was indifference. It burned deeper than any argument could have. Ava's throat tightened. She turned quickly and walked back toward the galley, keeping her steps even, her shoulders squared. She wouldn't let them see her break. But inside, her hands were shaking. In the cockpit, Captain James Adler placed the in-flight phone back on the hook, his jaw tight. He had been in aviation long enough to know what was coming next. He turned to his co-pilot, who had been listening closely the entire time. "We'll be receiving further instructions from ground control before we land," Captain Adler said evenly. The co-pilot hesitated. "So, is she fired?" Captain Adler let out a slow breath through his nose. "Not my call," he said, "but I'll tell you this. This won't just disappear." The cockpit fell into thoughtful silence, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Back in first class, Daniel sat back, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. He wasn't angry, he wasn't gloating, he was simply waiting, because he knew something Ava Monroe didn't. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The real consequences were waiting for her when the plane landed. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere was anything but steady. Tension clung to the air like humidity before a storm. Thick and undeniable, Ava Monroe stood inside the galley, her back pressed against the counter, breathing slowly, deliberately. She had spent years mastering control, knowing exactly how to handle difficult passengers and challenging situations. But this was unlike anything she had ever faced. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the counter as she replayed the last few minutes in her head. She had been forced to walk back through economy, the same aisle she had sent Daniel Cole down earlier, and every single passenger had seen it. The whispers, the way they stared, the shift in energy. They weren't just watching a flight attendant do her job. They were watching her undo her mistake. And worse, they were watching her lose. A quiet voice broke through her thoughts. "You're really sweating this, huh?" Ava turned sharply. Rachel Carter stood near the entrance of the galley, arms crossed, watching her carefully. "I don't need your input right now," Ava snapped, but her voice lacked the bite it usually had. Rachel smirked, tilting her head slightly. "I'm just saying," she murmured, "you don't look as confident as you did 20 minutes ago." Ava's jaw tightened. She wasn't going to entertain this conversation. She had worked hard for her position, climbed through the ranks, made decisions based on efficiency, order, and professionalism. She had been so sure she had done the right thing. And yet, here she was, gripping the counter like a lifeline, feeling her world tilt. Rachel sighed, shaking her head. "You know," she said, "if you had just treated him like any other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening." Ava shot her a glare. "I didn't do anything wrong." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Ava's pulse kicked up. "That's not. Save it." Rachel's voice was sharper now, because we both know what's coming when we land. Ava Monroe felt a cold chill creep down her spine. She hadn't let herself think about it yet. What exactly was waiting for her when the plane touched the ground? A passenger complaint? A meeting with a supervisor? A warning? Or worse, would this be career-ending? She shoved the thought away. She wasn't about to let one passenger ruin everything she had worked for. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she even had a say in it anymore. Meanwhile, in first class, Daniel Cole sat comfortably in his seat. But he wasn't relaxed. His mind was elsewhere, working through the bigger picture. This wasn't just about a single flight attendant making a bad judgment call. It was about a system that had allowed people like Ava Monroe to act with unchecked authority for far too long. And now, for once, there would be consequences. A new message popped up on his phone. "Assistant finalizing details. There will be an official response after landing." Daniel smirked slightly. He knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't going to be a quiet slap on the wrist. No. Ava Monroe wasn't just going to be spoken to. She was about to become an example. He set his phone down and glanced around the first-class cabin. The same passengers who had eagerly watched him be escorted out earlier now avoided his gaze. Funny how people only cared once they realized they were sitting next to someone with power. But what about all the times this had happened to others? The ones without power. The ones who never got an apology. The ones who never got their seats back. The ones who never had the satisfaction of seeing justice served. Daniel's jaw tensed slightly. Maybe it was time for that to change. The plane continued its smooth journey through the sky. But inside, the atmosphere was anything but steady. For Ava Monroe, every second stretched into an eternity. She stood in the galley, gripping the counter, feeling like she was sinking deeper with every breath. Her once unshakable confidence was crumbling, and for the first time, she had no control over what happened next. For Daniel, however, time was moving fast. Decisions were being made behind the scenes. Pieces were falling into place, and for the rest of the passengers, the shift in energy was undeniable. Even those who had been indifferent at the start of the flight now sensed that something much bigger was happening. Ava took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. The rules, the structure, the authority she had always relied on, it had all turned against her in an instant. For years, she had believed her instincts were infallible, that she had the right to decide who belonged where. But now, for the first time, she was the one being judged. And worse, she was waiting for a punishment she had no control over. Rachel Carter, still leaning against the galley entrance, finally broke the silence. "You should probably sit down before you collapse." Ava shot her a glare, but there was no real fire behind it. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, reached for a tray, and forced herself back into work mode, adjusting the glasses on the cart with mechanical precision. "I have a job to do," she muttered. Rachel gave her a long look, then smirked. "For now." Ava pretended not to hear that. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, handled demanding executives, entitled businessmen, and unruly travelers. She had made tough calls, enforced order, moved passengers when necessary, but this wasn't about a seating issue. This was about judgment, about who she had assumed didn't belong, about the man she had humiliated in front of an entire plane. Her hands trembled slightly as she set a glass down. The realization clawed at her. She had embarrassed the one person on this flight who had the power to end her career with a single email. And she had done it publicly. She glanced toward the cockpit, wondering if she should go there herself, try to explain, try to defend herself before they landed. But deep down, she knew there was no explanation that would fix this. Back in first class, Daniel leaned back in his seat, scrolling through his emails. His assistant had already sent over a preliminary report. As expected, the situation was gaining traction. The airline had taken notice. And when the plane landed, this wouldn't just be an uncomfortable conversation. It would be a reckoning. This was being escalated. Daniel Cole knew this airline inside and out. He knew exactly how situations like this were handled. Ava Monroe wouldn't just be quietly reassigned to another flight. No, this incident would be reviewed at the highest level, and not just for her, but for the entire staff. Because this wasn't about one mistake. This was about how many times things like this had happened, without consequences. Daniel glanced up briefly, noticing the awkward glances from other passengers. Some had seen what happened. Some had chosen to ignore it, but now they weren't sure what to do. Because now, they knew who he was. He exhaled slowly, stretching his fingers before tapping out a quick message. Daniel, we're landing in less than an hour. Make sure the ground team is ready. His assistant's reply was immediate. Assistant, they'll be waiting at the gate. Daniel's expression remained unchanged. He had never been the kind of man to shout or throw his weight around unnecessarily. But then there were times when a quiet lesson carried more weight than a loud one. And this would be one of those times. The flight crew knows. In the galley, the rest of the flight crew had noticed the shift. Even those who had been neutral at first were starting to sense the fallout coming. One of the attendants, Eric Dawson, nudged Rachel Carter. "What's going on?" he asked. Rachel crossed her arms. "Ava messed up. Badly." Eric frowned. Yeah, I saw her move that guy, but..." Rachel cut him off. "That guy," she said flatly, "is Daniel Cole." Eric froze. His eyes widened slightly as the full weight of that name sank in. "No way," he muttered. "She kicked him out of first class?" Rachel smirked slightly, but there was no humor in it. "Yep." Eric rubbed the back of his neck. "Damn, she's done, isn't she?" Rachel let out a slow breath. "If she's lucky, she'll just be fired." Eric's brows lifted. "If she's lucky?" Rachel glanced toward the first-class cabin, where Daniel sat, unbothered, completely in control of the situation. She shook her head. "We work in the airline industry, Eric." She turned back to him, her voice lower now. "What do you think happens when you humiliate the man who owns the sky you're flying in?" Eric let out a low whistle. His gaze flickered toward Ava, who was still standing in the galley, pretending to be busy. But everyone could see the truth now. She was sweating. The descent begins. A few minutes later, the seatbelt sign dinged on. The captain's voice came through the intercom, smooth, professional, but carrying an unspoken weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We'll be landing shortly." Daniel casually buckled his seatbelt. His expression remained unchanged. But he checked his phone one last time. New message. Security has been notified. The executive team will be waiting at the gate. Ava Monroe is expected to report immediately upon landing. Daniel smirked slightly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't a man who enjoyed watching people suffer, but he did believe in accountability. And Ava Monroe, she had no idea how much trouble was waiting for her. Just beyond the runway, Ava feels the walls closing in. The descent had begun. But for Ava Monroe, the real drop was only just starting. She stood near the galley, arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring blankly at the seatbelt sign above her. She could hear the low murmur of passengers fastening their belts, the rustling of belongings being tucked away, the routine sounds of landing preparations. But all she could focus on was the slow, sinking realization that this flight was not going to end like any other. She had spent years believing she understood power, that she could command control with a firm voice, a straight posture, a confident stare. But now, she was beginning to realize something. Real power didn't need to shout. It didn't need to argue. It just waited. And right now, Daniel Cole was waiting. He sat comfortably, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't impatient. He was simply watching, waiting. As the wheels of accountability turned, slowly but surely. Ava, on the other hand, she felt like she was suffocating. Ava Monroe had made mistakes before. Everyone did. But none had ever felt quite like this. None had ever unraveled so quickly, so publicly. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall. She had always been good at handling pressure. But as the plane drew closer to landing, she wasn't sure if she could handle what was coming next. Because for the first time in her career, she wasn't in control. And she had a feeling she never would be again. The plane continued its gradual descent. The hum of the engine remained steady. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. Daniel Cole tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest. His expression was calm, but his mind was sharp. He wasn't a man who enjoyed humiliating others for sport, nor was he needlessly cruel. But this wasn't just about. He had been in the airline industry long enough to know this kind of thing happened far too often. Passengers were judged. Passengers were dismissed. And most of the time, they never got justice. But this time was different. He could feel it. Not just from the shift in altitude, but from the way the entire crew was moving now. The flight attendants, once confident and composed, were now stealing nervous glances toward Ava Monroe. Some had already begun to distance themselves from her, sensing the inevitable outcome. Near the aisle, Rachel Carter exchanged a quick look with Eric Dawson. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. They knew what was coming. Ava Monroe was finished. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth as ever. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Ava's fingers curled into a fist. She forced herself to stand tall, to keep her breathing steady, to pretend that everything was normal. But everything was not normal. Because in less than 10 minutes, she would be stepping off this plane. Not as a respected flight attendant with years of experience, but as a woman walking straight into a storm. She had to think. What could she do? Would an apology be enough? Could she explain her way out of this? No, she had already apologized, and Daniel Cole had already decided this wasn't just about whether she kept her job, it was about whether she walked away with her reputation intact. And deep down, she already knew the answer to that. The wheels hit the runway with a firm jolt. The plane began its controlled deceleration. The engines roared briefly before settling into a smooth taxi toward the gate. Around her, passengers exhaled, stretching, reaching for their belongings, most of them blissfully unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. But Ava felt like she couldn't breathe. Her hands itched to grab the in-flight phone, to ask the captain if she needed to report anywhere upon landing. But she already knew the answer. It was out of her hands now. She took one last slow breath and adjusted her uniform, clinging to whatever authority she had left. But when she looked up, she met Rachel Carter's gaze. The younger flight attendant didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes said everything. The intercom crackled one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today. Daniel didn't move right away. He could feel the tension radiating from the galley, from the staff, from the few passengers who had put the pieces together. He wasn't angry, he wasn't smug, he was just waiting, because the hardest part of this flight hadn't even begun for Ava Monroe, and she had no idea how bad it was about to get. As the plane rolled toward the gate, two uniformed men in dark suits stood just beyond the glass, security, and standing behind them, a senior airline executive. Their arms were crossed, their expressions unreadable, and they were waiting for her. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Around her, passengers stood, stretching their legs, grabbing their bags. The usual shuffle of disembarkation began, but for Ava Monroe, there was nothing usual about this moment. This wasn't just another landing. This was the end of something, and she could feel it. The seatbelt sign had barely turned off, but Ava couldn't move. She sat frozen in the galley, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. In first class, passengers moved around Daniel, indifferent, oblivious, unaware of the storm brewing in the galley behind them. To the rest of the passengers, this was just another flight. But for Ava Monroe, this was a reckoning. A final sinking realization washed over her. She had miscalculated badly. And now, the consequences were waiting for her just beyond that jet bridge. Daniel Cole adjusted his jacket, glancing toward the galley one last time before stepping off the plane. He didn't need to say anything. The message had already been sent. Ava swallowed hard, her throat dry. She forced herself to take one shaky step forward. She knew that beyond that door, her fate was sealed. And for the first time in her career, she was completely powerless. Her eyes flickered to the cabin door, where security and a senior airline executive stood just beyond the glass. They weren't here for a random passenger disturbance. They weren't here for an airport issue. They were here for her. Her stomach twisted. She had always been the one with authority, the one with control, the one making the rules and enforcing them. But now, she was the one being summoned. She glanced toward Daniel's seat. He hadn't even stood up yet. While the rest of the passengers grabbed their carry-ons, stretching and making polite small talk, he remained calm, still composed, and waiting. She knew why. Because Daniel Cole didn't need to rush. He knew what was coming. Ava inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stand straight, adjust her uniform, step forward. She had always believed in handling things with professionalism. But now, she wasn't sure if professionalism would even matter. She took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle, and immediately she felt the shift. Passengers who had once ignored her now stole quick glances as she walked past. Some had watched what happened earlier, piecing together that something was wrong. Others simply followed the tension in the air. Ava walked past economy, past the very seat where she had forced Daniel to sit only hours ago. Now, she was the one being forced into something, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As Ava approached the cabin door, Daniel finally stood. He stretched, slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. Then, with the same calm energy he had maintained throughout the flight, he stepped into the aisle. Nearby passengers stiffened, realizing just how much had shifted since takeoff. Ava reached the exit first, standing just a few feet from the airline executive and security. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. The executive didn't speak immediately. Neither did security. They were waiting for Daniel to disembark first. And that was when Ava finally understood. This wasn't just about removing a passenger from first class. This was about removing the wrong one. She heard Daniel's footsteps behind her as he approached the exit. His presence, radiating power without even trying. Then, for the first time, since she had been forced to bring him back to first class, he finally spoke to her. His voice was calm, level, and quiet enough that only she could hear. Next time, check the ticket before you check the person. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't mocking, it was just the truth. A truth she should have already known. Daniel stepped past her, through the door, greeted by the airline executive with a handshake and a nod of respect. A nod that she would never receive again. Ava stared straight ahead, feeling the walls of her career closing in. The airline executive finally spoke. "Miss Monroe." His voice was formal, clipped, carrying the weight of something final. "Come with us." She didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself. There was nothing left to say, because for the first time in her life, she understood. She was no longer the one in charge. And she never would be again. Ava's legs felt unsteady as she stepped onto the jet bridge, each step heavier than the last. The noise of the airport, distant announcements, rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, felt muted, almost unreal. She'd walked through these corridors hundreds of times, always with authority, with purpose, with confidence. But now she wasn't walking as a leader. She was walking as the accused, the airline executive, a tall man in a sharp gray suit, his face like stone, walked ahead without looking back. Ava Monroe walked forward, her posture straight. Security followed closely behind, silent but present, making it clear this was not optional. She swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to hold on to some piece of dignity, trying to believe that somehow, some way, she could fix this. But deep down, she knew the truth. Some mistakes couldn't be undone. Some choices had consequences that couldn't be erased. And this was one of them. Maybe, just maybe, she could still find a way to save herself. A few feet away, Daniel Cole stepped off the plane, into an entirely different world. A sleek black car with tinted windows waited just outside the private terminal entrance. His assistant, Mark Bennett, stood beside it, a tablet in one hand, his phone in the other. Mark barely looked up as Daniel approached, already multitasking between emails and messages. "The board is aware," Mark said smoothly, stepping aside as Daniel slid into the back seat of the car. "They want to handle this internally before anything goes public." Daniel leaned back against the seat, unbothered, adjusting his watch. "And Monroe?" he asked, his voice calm. "Even." Mark finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Being escorted to a private meeting room as we speak." Daniel smirked slightly. "I hope she enjoys her last meeting as an airline employee." Mark hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" He exhaled, then added carefully, "I mean, a full termination? Wouldn't a suspension be enough?" Daniel's gaze flickered toward Mark, his usual calm expression sharpening just slightly. Mark exhaled, already knowing the answer. "This isn't about her," Daniel said, his voice cool, measured. "This is about all the people like her, the ones who have done the same thing and never got caught." Mark nodded once. He had seen this before. Daniel wasn't interested in petty revenge. He was interested in change. And Ava Monroe? She had just become the example. Ava Monroe was led down a quiet hallway, past the usual airport offices, past the places she had once walked with authority. Now, she was being led, like someone who no longer belonged. At the end of the hall, a single door. Security opened it for her, stepping aside. She hesitated, standing in the doorway, her breath shallow. Inside, a small soundproof conference room. A long table stretched across the center. Papers, neatly stacked. A single chair pulled out, waiting for her. She stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind her. Across the table, 3 senior airline officials sat in silence. They were not flight supervisors. They were not managers. These were executives. The ones who decided who stayed and who was removed. The ones who held her future in their hands. Ava swallowed hard. She slowly sat down, back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. No one spoke. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the older woman in the center, steel-gray hair, an unreadable expression, folded her hands on the table and spoke. "Miss Monroe," she said, her voice as calm as it was final. "Have a seat." Ava sat stiffly, her heart pounded in her chest. The room was still, too still. Then, the gray-haired executive spoke again. "Do you understand why you're here?" Ava's mouth felt dry. She knew, whatever she said next would determine the rest of her career. She licked her lips, forcing her voice to remain steady. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully, a seating issue on the flight. The second executive, a tall man with a firm jaw and sharp eyes, raised an eyebrow. "A seating issue?" Ava forced herself not to flinch. "Yes," she continued. "A misunderstanding about a passenger's status in first class." The third executive, a bold man who had been silently reading over the official report, finally looked up. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice flat, unimpressed. "Miss Monroe, is that what you're calling it?" The room fell into silence, and suddenly, Ava knew. They weren't here to hear her side of the story. They already had the facts. The reports had been filed, the statements had been gathered, her actions had been reviewed, and now, they were simply here to deliver the verdict. She wasn't getting out of this. The gray-haired executive finally slid a piece of paper toward her, her voice steady, like a judge passing sentence. Effective immediately, she paused, letting the words sink in. "You are relieved of your position as senior flight attendant." Ava felt her stomach drop. "Your employment with this airline," a final pause, "has been terminated." Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened against the edge of the table. The second executive held up a hand, silencing her. There was no room for negotiation, no room for debate. The decision had been made. There was no negotiation, no room for debate. The decision had been made. Ava Monroe felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, heavier than she had ever imagined. She had spent years believing she held power, that her authority was absolute. But now, for the first time, she truly understood. She was no longer in control, and she never would be again. "This decision is final." The second executive's voice was firm. "Your conduct on Flight 417 was unacceptable. You failed to verify a first-class passenger's ticket. You acted on assumption, and you publicly humiliated a man who had every right to be in that seat." The third executive leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. His voice dropped, turning colder. "Miss Monroe." A beat of silence. "Then the passenger you humiliated was Daniel Cole." The weight of those words crushed any last hope she had. She had spent years making snap judgments, deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, for the first time, she was the one being judged. And she had been found unworthy. Her gaze fell to the termination letter. Her eyes burned. A decade of flying, years of experience, all gone. Because of one choice, one wrong choice. Her mind raced, grasping for something to say. Anything that might change the outcome, but there was nothing. No second chances, no negotiations, just the cold, brutal weight of accountability. The gray-haired executive stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Security will escort you out." And just like that, it was over. Ava slowly rose from her chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the termination letter. As she turned to leave, the third executive spoke one last time. His tone was almost thoughtful. "Maybe next time, before you judge someone by their appearance," a pause, "you'll think twice." She didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. She walked to the door, her vision blurred. Her body felt heavier than it ever had. Security opened the door, and as she stepped into the hallway, the reality of what had just happened finally hit her. She had entered that room as a senior flight attendant. Now, she was just another person, walking out of an airport with nowhere to go. Ava stepped out of the conference room. The termination letter, still clenched in her trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried every mistake she had made on that flight. Security walked a step behind her, but they didn't have to drag her out. She wasn't resisting. What would be the point? The long, sterile hallway of the airline's administrative offices felt surreal. Just hours ago, she had been the one giving orders, standing firm, controlling situations with authority. Now, she was being escorted out of the very company she had dedicated a decade of her life to. Every step she took felt heavier, like she was walking through quicksand. It wasn't just a job she had lost, it was her identity. A career gone in seconds. She had been good at this job, or at least she had believed she was. Strict, yes. Firm, absolutely. But in her mind, that had been part of the job, keeping passengers in check, maintaining order, making judgment calls. She had never second-guessed herself, until today. Because now, she was finally being forced to look at the way she had handled things. And what she saw wasn't pretty. Her mind kept replaying the moment, the way she had questioned Daniel Cole before even looking at his ticket, the confidence in her voice as she dismissed him, the satisfaction she had felt sending him to economy. She had been so sure she was right, and that certainty had destroyed her. Security led her through a side exit, away from the main passenger terminals. No public firing, no dramatic scene. Just quiet, deliberate consequences. But that almost made it worse, because this was the kind of punishment that didn't fade with time. This was the kind of punishment that would follow her. Her reputation was ruined. She pushed open the exit door and stepped into the warm afternoon air. For the first time in 10 years, she was outside the airport, without a uniform, without a title, without a purpose. She wasn't staff anymore. She wasn't part of this world. She was just another former employee, walking toward an uncertain future. A part of her wanted to scream. But what was the point? No one was listening. No one was coming to help her. And for the first time in her life, she truly understood what it felt like to be powerless. Ava Monroe had nothing left to defend. What was the point? The entire airline knew what she had done. Her name was probably already circulating through aviation circles. A cautionary tale of what happens when you judge the wrong person. Would she ever get hired by another airline? She doubted it. Her reputation was ruined. She had spent years making snap decisions about passengers, and now the industry had made a snap decision about her. Meanwhile, just a few yards away, a black luxury car sat parked near the private exit. Inside, Daniel Cole watched. Ava had just stepped outside, standing still in the open air, like she didn't know where to go. She hadn't seen him yet. Mark Bennett, his assistant, checked his phone, then looked up. "She's out." Daniel didn't respond right away. He just watched her, his face unreadable. Mark followed his gaze. "She looks lost." A moment passed. Finally, Daniel exhaled through his nose. "She should be." Mark hesitated, then asked, "Do you think she'll learn anything from this?" Daniel leaned his head back against the seat, stared at the roof of the car. And after a moment, he admitted, "I don't know. Some people do, some people don't." Mark nodded. Then after another pause, "Do you think she deserved to be fired?" Daniel thought about it. He wasn't a vengeful man. He didn't enjoy watching people lose everything. But this had never been about revenge. This was about accountability. "I think she deserved to know." His voice was calm, measured. What it feels like to be dismissed without a second thought. To be treated like an inconvenience, like she doesn't belong, because that's exactly what she did to me. Mark didn't argue. They both knew this wasn't just about one flight attendant. This was about the way people in power misuse that power. And today, for once, the consequences had landed on the right person. Ava finally moved. Slowly. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling, scrolling through her contacts. She needed to call someone. A friend. A former colleague. Someone who could help. She needed to find a way back into the industry. Because if she didn't, she had nowhere else to go. This job had been her entire life. And now she had nothing. She clicked on a contact, a former manager she had worked with years ago. Pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. She swallowed, then tried another contact. Voicemail. Another. Voicemail. Her stomach tightened, something cold and sharp settling inside her. They knew. They all knew. No one was going to help her. No one wanted to be associated with her name now. The realization hit her like a gut punch. She had spent years making decisions about people. And now, the industry had made a decision about her. She slowly lowered the phone, stared at nothing. Her body felt numb. Because for the first time since this whole thing had started, for the first time since she had told Daniel Cole to move to economy, without even checking his ticket, she finally understood. She finally saw herself the way others had seen her. Not as a leader, not as a professional, but as someone who had let power get to her head. And now she had none left. She had misjudged the wrong person. And the price? Everything. From inside the car, Daniel watched her, his expression still unreadable. Mark sat beside him, silent, the air between them heavy. Then, Daniel finally spoke, but not to anyone in particular, just a simple thought, quiet, measured. Maybe next time she'll think twice. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, as the car pulled away from the curb, because this time, for once, the lesson hadn't been for him, it had been for her. Ava Monroe stood on the sidewalk, outside the airport's private exit. Her phone, still clutched in her trembling hand. The screen had gone dark, but she couldn't put it away. She had called everyone she could think of. No one had answered. Not a single one. Her stomach twisted. The industry had turned its back on her. Before she even had a chance to explain herself. She had spent her career thinking she was untouchable. That senior flight attendants didn't get fired. Not like this. Not permanently. They got reassigned, transferred, given another chance. But this wasn't a mistake that could be brushed aside. This wasn't a quiet meeting with a slap on the wrist. This hadn't been a simple seating issue. This had been a public humiliation. A decision made on bias, not facts. And now, she was paying the full price. Ava Monroe's breath quickened. Panic crept in. What was she supposed to do now? She had spent 10 years building this career. Long hours, overnight shifts, handling difficult passengers. She had earned her place at the top. Or at least, she had thought she had. But in the end, it had taken less than a minute to erase everything. The weight of her actions settled heavily on her. As she watched the sleek black car disappear from view, Daniel Cole was gone now. He had walked off the plane, with his reputation intact, his authority unquestioned, his career unchanged. And she had walked off with nothing. She knew he hadn't done this to be cruel. That was what made it worse. He hadn't yelled at her. He hadn't demanded she be fired. He hadn't even been angry. He had simply let her dig her own grave. Because the moment she had refused to check his ticket, the moment she had decided he wasn't worthy of first class, based on nothing but an assumption, she had sealed her own fate. She had done this to herself. For the first time, she was forced to confront a reality she had spent years avoiding. How many others had she treated the same way? How many times had she dismissed someone, based on appearance alone? How many passengers had she forced into economy, into discomfort, into humiliation, without giving them any way to fight back? The difference between them and Daniel Cole? They hadn't owned the airline. They had just taken their mistreatment quietly. Now, she was the one forced to sit in the discomfort of her own decisions. A gust of wind blew against her. But she barely noticed. Her mind was spinning. What now? She couldn't just walk back into the airport and pretend nothing had happened. She couldn't just apply to another airline and hope they wouldn't hear about this because they already had. The airline industry was a small world. and news traveled fast. Even if this incident never made headlines, the right people already knew. Every application she sent would hit a dead end. Every recommendation letter would be ignored. Her name was already stained. She had no backup plan. This job had been her entire life. She had never needed to think about what she would do if it disappeared. And now, she had to figure it out, alone. A couple of airport employees walked past her, chatting casually, heading toward the staff entrance. She had walked through that door so many times before, but now, she was locked out of the very world she had controlled for years. Her authority, gone. Her status, gone. Her certainty, gone. She wanted to convince herself that this was unfair, that she had been treated too harshly, that she deserved another chance. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had built her career on making judgment calls, and today, judgment had finally been passed on her. She turned, walking away from the airport, not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to go. For the first time in her life, she was the one being left behind. Her footsteps felt heavier with every step she took away from the airport. The smooth, polished floors of the terminal were now behind her, replaced by the rough, uneven pavement leading toward the distant parking lot. The world she had once ruled, the flights, the attendants, the passengers, the unchallenged authority she had carried for years, was no longer hers. And for the first time in a decade, she had nowhere to go. She had always thought of the airport as her second home. Now, it was just another place she wasn't welcome. A place where people she had once commanded would whisper about her, as she faded into a cautionary tale. The weight of finality settled in. This was it. She had misjudged the wrong person. And the price? Everything. She had memorized every corner of this airport, the break rooms, where she had sipped coffee before early morning flights, the customer service counters, where she had watched travelers fumble with their documents. She had known the airline codes by heart, the emergency protocols like second nature, the best ways to handle passengers, or so she had thought. But now, none of that mattered anymore. She had walked these halls with power. Now, she was just another person, walking away, with nothing. She had spent years believing she was untouchable. She had enforced rules, made judgment calls, decided who belonged and who didn't. But today, she had learned a hard truth. Power is temporary, authority is fragile, and the moment you start misusing it, the world will take it away from you. Ava Monroe had spent a decade in control. Now, she was just another former employee, walking out of an airport. With nowhere to go, Ava Monroe walked through the employee exit, her steps slow and heavy. The security officer standing nearby watched her pass. He had seen her countless times before, rushing to flights, giving orders, demanding efficiency. She had always moved with authority. Now, she was just another face, another fired employee, another mistake walking out of the airport. She didn't look at him. Her chest tightened as she stepped through the automatic doors into the late afternoon heat. For a brief, desperate moment, she almost turned back, almost walked back inside, almost tried to explain herself. One more time, but there was no one left to listen. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers unsteady. She scrolled through her contacts, but the names blurred before her eyes. Her mind grasped for someone, anyone, who could help. Maybe she could talk to an old supervisor. Maybe she could find a way to get reinstated. Maybe she could fix this. But as she clicked on name after name, one thing became painfully clear. Nobody was answering. Voicemail after voicemail. Unread messages. Silence. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She had spent years enforcing order, making decisions, controlling people's fates. And now, she was powerless. She had spent her career deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, she was the one who didn't belong anywhere. She exhaled sharply, blinking hard, forcing herself to keep walking. She wouldn't break. She refused to. She had been a flight attendant for a decade. She had seen grown men sob over missed flights, families break down over lost luggage, angry passengers reduced to nothing when their demands weren't met. She had watched people lose their tempers, their patience, their dignity. But now, it was her turn. She was the one, on the receiving end of a reality she had once enforced, and it felt different when it was happening to her. Daniel Cole sat in the back of his car, watching the airport grow smaller in the distance. Beside him, Mark Bennett tapped at his laptop, reviewing the final report from the airline's executive team. After a moment, he spoke. "Her termination is official." Daniel nodded slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He wasn't surprised. Big corporations rarely like to admit when something goes wrong. They would handle this quietly. Ava Monroe would be removed from their records, erased from the employee database, and the whole incident would be buried. It was the airline industry's way of moving on, without consequences. But this time, there had been consequences. Daniel turned to Mark. "Any sign that she's trying to fight it?" Mark shook his head. "She's been calling people, but no one's responding." Her connections were distancing themselves already. Daniel wasn't surprised. In this world, reputation meant everything. And hers, it was already ruined. Mark hesitated, then glanced at his boss. "Do you ever feel bad about things like this?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. Then, after a long pause, he admitted, "I don't like watching people lose their livelihood." Mark raised an eyebrow, but Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "But I don't like watching people get away with treating others like they're nothing either." Mark nodded slowly. "Understanding. Has she done this before?" Daniel continued. "How many people has she treated like that? How many passengers has she humiliated just because she could? How many times has she misused her authority without a second thought?" Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both already knew the answer. Daniel exhaled, his voice low, steady. This wasn't about revenge, it never was, but people like her, they don't learn until they have no choice. Mark shut his laptop, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think she'll learn?" Daniel's eyes remained on the fading airport in the distance, and after a moment, he said simply, "I guess we'll find out." The car pulled away from the airport, leaving Ava Monroe standing alone in the heat, staring down at the phone that no one would answer. She had spent years deciding who deserved a seat at the table, and now she had none left for herself. There is a valuable lesson to be learned from this story, one that extends beyond the airline industry and into everyday life. It's a lesson about fairness, about respect, about the consequences of our actions. People in positions of power often make snap judgments, without considering the full picture. Sometimes it's a flight attendant assuming someone doesn't belong in first class. Sometimes it's an employer dismissing an employee without a second thought. Sometimes it's just a simple misunderstanding. That carries real consequences. The truth is, respect and fairness should not be reserved for those with power. They should be given to everyone. Ava Monroe believed she was untouchable because of her title, her status, her authority. But the moment she was stripped of it, she realized how fragile her world truly was. The same judgment she had passed on others had now been passed on her. Have you ever judged someone too quickly, dismissed someone without a fair chance, or felt powerless because of someone else's unfair treatment? Let this story be a reminder. Every action has a consequence. The way we treat people today can shape our future in ways we never expect. Fairness, respect, and the consequences of our actions. In today's world, we often see people in positions of power making snap judgments, sometimes without considering the full picture. It could be a flight attendant assuming someone doesn't belong in first class, an employer dismissing an employee without a second thought, or even a simple misunderstanding in everyday interactions. But the truth is, the way we treat others matters. Ava Monroe's downfall wasn't about a single mistake. It was about a pattern of behavior, a belief that she had the power to decide who was worthy and who wasn't. She never thought twice about her actions, because in her mind, her judgment was final. But what happens when those in power misuse it? Eventually, consequences catch up, and sometimes they arrive in a way no one expects. Daniel Cole was one of the few who had the ability to make sure she faced those consequences. But what about the countless others who have been treated unfairly without the means to fight back? How many passengers had been dismissed? How many employees had been overlooked? How many people had been judged based on assumptions rather than facts? The truth is, respect and fairness should not be reserved only for those with power. They should be given to everyone, regardless of status, regardless of appearance, regardless of assumptions. This story serves as a reminder. No one is untouchable. Power is not permanent, because the same way we judge others, one day we may be judged the same way. Ava Monroe believed she was invincible because of her title, her position, her authority, but the moment she was stripped of it, she realized how fragile her world truly was. For years she enforced rules, she made decisions, she determined people's worth in the airline industry, but in the end, those same rules applied to her. And when it was her turn to be on the receiving end of unfair treatment, there was no one left to defend her. This lesson applies to all of us, at work, in public, in personal relationships. The way we treat people matters. We never know when the roles might be reversed. The employee you dismiss today could be the one making hiring decisions tomorrow. The customer you treat poorly could one day be in a position of authority over you, because life has a way of bringing things full circle. And respect is one of the few things that can stand the test of time. Ava Monroe sat at the bus stop, alone, without the power she once wielded. For the first time, she was forced to reflect on everything she had done. She had always believed that authority meant control, but now she understood something deeper. True power comes from how you treat others. It comes from respect, from fairness, from integrity. The moment she stopped seeing passengers as people and started seeing them as inconveniences, she had already set herself on a path to failure. Today, we live in a world where assumptions are made quickly. In workplaces, on social media, in daily interactions, people judge based on appearance, status, preconceived notions. But this story is a wake-up call. It challenges us to think before we act, to treat people with kindness, to remember power is fleeting. What remains is our reputation, our character, the impact we leave on those around us. Have you ever judged someone too quickly? Have you dismissed someone without giving them a fair chance? Have you ever felt powerless because of someone else's unfair treatment? Let this story be a reminder. Every action has a consequence. The way we treat people today can shape our future in ways we never expect. Ava Monroe's story is not unique. It plays out across different industries, different situations, different lives. But the lesson remains the same. Respect is earned through how we treat others, and fairness should never be an afterthought. Ava Monroe's downfall wasn't about one wrong move. It was about a lifetime of choices finally catching up to her. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on notifications so you never miss more stories like this.